The house was silent. 3 in the morning, June 15th, 1971. Louis Armstrong sat alone in the small room off his kitchen in Corona, Queens. His doctor had forbidden him to play trumpet. His heart was failing. Every breath required effort. In 3 weeks he would be dead. What he knew in this moment was simpler. There was one thing left to say, and words would not be enough. On the table sat his trumpet, and a borrowed reel-to-reel tape recorder. No one knew he was awake. No one knew what he was about to do. And for 30 years, no one would know this recording existed. This is the story of Louis Armstrong's final musical statement, made in darkness, discovered decades later, recognized as perhaps the most honest thing he ever created. By June 1971, Louis Armstrong was dying. The official narrative spoke of rest and recovery. His wife Lucille told reporters he was getting stronger, but the truth lived in the spaces between reassuring words. Armstrong had suffered a severe heart attack 2 months earlier. He survived, but came home diminished. The man who had performed through pain for 50 years was now confined to his house, forbidden from the activity that defined his existence, forbidden from playing his trumpet. Dr. Gary Zucker had been uncompromising during the final hospital consultation. "Louis, your heart cannot handle the exertion. Playing trumpet requires intense cardiovascular effort. If you pick up that horn, you could trigger another heart attack, and next time you might not survive." Armstrong nodded slowly. Lucille squeezed his hand. "He understands, doctor. He won't play." Dr. Zucker looked at Armstrong directly. "I need to hear it from you." Armstrong met his eyes. "I won't play," he said. It was a promise he intended to break. The weeks following his return home were the strangest of Armstrong's life. For the first time in memory, music existed around him, but not through him. Friends visited and talked about upcoming gigs. Lucille played his records in the living room. The telephone rang with offers for concerts, all of which had to be declined. Armstrong listened from his bedroom, or favorite chair, physically present but musically absent. It was like being a ghost in his own life, without music flowing through him. Who was he? At night, when Lucille was asleep, Armstrong would go to the small room off the kitchen where he kept his instruments and recording equipment. He would sit and look at his trumpet in its case, the way someone might look at a photograph of a lost love. He did not open the case. He kept his promise, technically, but the longing was constant and painful. There were things he still wanted to say through music, feelings that had no adequate verbal expression, musical ideas that came between sleep and waking, all of it trapped inside with no way out. The distance between what he felt and what he could express grew wider each day. By mid-June, Armstrong had reached a decision. It grew slowly, inevitably. He was going to make one final recording, not for release, not for an audience, just for himself, to prove the music still existed inside him, that dying had not killed what was essential. He would do it alone, late at night, when no one could stop him. He would record one song, whatever his body could manage, and then he would decide what to do with the tape later, or maybe do nothing at all. Maybe just making it would be enough. The practical logistics were simple. Armstrong had been making home recordings for years. He had a good reel-to-reel recorder, and knew how to operate it. His neighbor Thomas Brennan had recently lent him an old machine, thinking it might amuse him to listen to old recordings during recovery. Now it would serve a different purpose. The trumpet was the bigger question. He needed to play quietly enough not to wake Lucille upstairs. Playing with a mute would muffle the sound but change the tone in ways he did not want. He decided to risk playing softly, trusting that the late hour and closed doors would contain the sound. On the night of June 15th, Armstrong waited until he was certain Lucille was deeply asleep. He heard her breathing settle into the deep rhythm of sleep around 1 in the morning. He waited another hour to be safe. Then, moving carefully, he went downstairs. His heart was beating faster than it should, not from exertion but from anticipation. From knowing he was about to break every rule, violate every medical order, and possibly shorten his life. But the alternative, dying without making this music, felt worse than any physical risk. In the small room, he set up the recording equipment with practiced efficiency. He threaded the tape, checked the levels, positioned the microphone. His hands shook slightly, partly from medication, partly from emotion. He opened his trumpet case and lifted out the instrument. The weight was familiar, comforting. He assembled it slowly, giving himself time to be certain. When the trumpet was ready, he raised it to his lips and blew a soft tentative note. The sound was quieter than usual, his embouchure weaker, but it was music, real music, coming from him. Tears filled his eyes. He had not realized how much he missed this until he heard that first note. Armstrong sat in the chair, microphone positioned in front of him, tape running, and considered what to play. He had not planned this far ahead. What do you play when you know it might be the last thing you ever record? What song contains everything you want to say about music and life, and the strange journey from New Orleans poverty to worldwide fame and back to this small room in Queens at 3 in the morning? The answer came quietly, almost obviously. What a wonderful world. Not because it was his biggest hit, but because, despite everything, despite dying, despite pain, despite all the ways life was ending, he still believed it was true. The world was wonderful. Music made it so. He began to play. The first notes were soft, almost fragile. His breath control was not what it had been. His fingers moved more slowly. But none of that mattered because what emerged was purer than technical perfection. This was not performance. This was prayer. He played the melody straight at first, letting the familiar progression speak for itself. Then he began to improvise, finding spaces in the tune he had never noticed before, bending notes in ways that expressed both sadness and gratitude. The trumpet sounded different than it ever had, quieter, more intimate, as if he was whispering something sacred that only someone listening very closely could hear. There was no band, no rhythm section, no harmony, just one trumpet, one man, one final statement about what mattered. Halfway through the song, Armstrong's breathing became labored. He could feel his heart working harder than it should. Dr. Zucker's warnings echoed in his mind. But he did not stop, could not stop. This was bigger than medical caution or self-preservation. This was about leaving something true behind, about making sure the world knew, even if they did not discover it for decades, that Louis Armstrong died making music, that he chose this, that the final thing his body did was create beauty. He pushed through the difficulty, finding strength from some reserve he did not know he still possessed, and finished the song. The last note hung in the air, sustained as long as his breath allowed, then fading into silence. Armstrong lowered the trumpet and sat completely still, listening to the quiet. His heart was racing. His hands were shaking. Sweat covered his face. He felt exhausted and exhilarated simultaneously. He had done it, made music one last time, proved the essential thing was still there, still his. He reached over and stopped the tape recorder. The reel stopped spinning. The performance was captured. Now he had to decide what to do with it. He sat in the darkness, holding his trumpet, and did not have an answer. So he decided to do nothing, to simply let the tape exist, a secret between him and the music. What Armstrong did not know was that he was not entirely alone. Danny Barcelona, his drummer and longtime friend, had arrived at the house around 2:30. Louis had called him the previous day asking him to pick up some charts. Danny, knowing Louis's health was fragile, decided to check in late at night when Lucille would be asleep. He had his own key. He let himself in quietly and was heading toward the den when he heard it. The unmistakable sound of Louis's trumpet, playing so softly it was almost a whisper, playing What a Wonderful World. Danny froze in the hallway, trying to process what he was hearing. Louis was not supposed to play. The doctors had been explicit, but there was no mistaking that sound. Danny moved quietly toward the small room and stood outside the closed door, listening. He heard the song progress, heard the improvisation, heard the emotional weight in every note. He understood immediately what was happening. Louis was making a farewell recording, something for himself, something final. Danny's first instinct was to stop it, to protect his friend from the physical risk. But standing there in the dark hallway, listening to that heartbreaking performance, he could not bring himself to interrupt. This was too important, too sacred. So he simply listened, tears streaming down his face, until the last note faded. When Armstrong emerged from the room 10 minutes later, carefully carrying his trumpet, he nearly jumped when he saw Danny standing in the hallway. "Jesus, Danny, you scared the hell out of me. What are you doing here?" Danny looked at him for a long moment. "I heard you playing, Pops." Armstrong's face showed guilt, then resignation. "You gonna tell Lucille? Tell the doctor?" Danny shook his head. "That's not my business. But you okay? Your heart?" Armstrong nodded slowly. "I'm okay. Tired, but okay." They stood in the dark hallway, two old friends who had made music together for years, and something passed between them that required no words. "The tape," Danny said finally. "What are you going to do with it?" Armstrong shrugged. "Nothing. Just let it be." Danny nodded. "Can I listen to it? Someday?" Armstrong considered this. "Yeah, someday. Not now. Too fresh. But someday." They talked for another 20 minutes in quiet voices, and then Danny left. Armstrong went upstairs and climbed into bed beside Lucille, who slept through everything. His heart was still beating too fast, but his soul felt settled in a way it had not since the hospital. He had made his final music. Whatever came next, that was done. 3 weeks later, on July 6, 1971, Louis Armstrong died in his sleep. The news devastated the music world. Tributes poured in from around the globe. Lucille was overwhelmed by grief and logistics. In the chaos, no one thought about the tape in the small room. Danny Barcelona remembered, but in the immediate aftermath it felt wrong to mention it. Too soon, too raw. He decided to wait. But weeks turned into months, and the right moment never came. Eventually, Danny convinced himself that maybe the tape was meant to stay hidden. Maybe Louis had wanted it that way. So Danny kept quiet, and the tape sat in the small room, forgotten. Years passed. Louis Armstrong maintained the house in Corona as a shrine to Louis's memory. She gave tours to researchers, welcomed jazz scholars, donated materials to archives, but she rarely went into the small room off the kitchen. Too painful, too full of Louis's presence. The recording equipment sat undisturbed. The tape remained on the reel, exactly where Louis had left it. Dust accumulated. The house aged. Lucille aged. And the tape sat silent, containing the last music Louis Armstrong ever made, unknown to anyone except Danny Barcelona, who carried the secret into his own old age and eventually forgot to remember it clearly. In 1999, Michael Cogswell, director of the Louis Armstrong House Museum, was conducting a comprehensive inventory of the Corona house. The property was being prepared for transformation into a public museum. He worked methodically, room by room, documenting everything. When he reached the small room off the kitchen, he found the recording equipment covered in dust. The reel-to-reel machine looked like it had not been used in decades, but on the reels was tape. Cogswell's heart quickened. Tape meant recording. Recording meant potentially undiscovered Armstrong material. He carefully photographed everything in place, then gently removed the reels and took them to a preservation lab. The audio restoration specialist, Dr. Sarah Chen, handled the tape with extraordinary care. It was old, fragile, potentially degraded. She transferred it to digital format, working slowly to minimize damage. When the transfer was complete, she put on headphones and pressed play. What she heard made her stop breathing. Louis Armstrong's trumpet, playing What a Wonderful World, in a recording she had never heard before. Playing in a way she had never heard him play. So quietly, so intimately, so completely unlike any of his commercial recordings. She listened to the entire performance without moving, then immediately called Michael Cogswell. "You need to hear this," she said, her voice shaking. "Right now." Cogswell listened to the tape and understood within seconds he was hearing something extraordinary. This was not a rough demo, not a practice session. This was a complete performance. Fully realized, emotionally devastating. Technical analysis confirmed the recording had been made in June 1971, based on the tape type and degradation patterns, weeks before Armstrong's death, possibly days, and no one had known it existed. Cogswell spent months researching, trying to find any documentation. Nothing. No diary entry. No letter. No mention in Armstrong's papers. It was as if he had made it and erased all evidence except the tape itself. The question of what to do with the recording became complicated and emotional. On one hand, this was significant historical material, lost Armstrong, from the final days of his life. The world deserved to hear it. On the other hand, it had been hidden for 30 years. Maybe Louis had wanted it to stay private. Maybe releasing it would violate his final wishes. Cogswell consulted with musicologists, Armstrong's surviving family members, ethicists who specialized in posthumous artistic releases. The consensus was divided. Some argued that great art belonged to the world. Others insisted an artist's private work should remain private. The debate might have continued indefinitely, if not for a phone call from Danny Barcelona. Danny had heard through the jazz community that a previously unknown Armstrong recording had been discovered. Now, in his 80s, and in declining health, Danny suddenly remembered what he had witnessed that night in 1971, the secret he had carried, and then forgotten, and then half remembered as something that might have been a dream. He called Cogswell, and told him everything. The late-night visit, the whispered conversation, Louis's insistence that the tape should exist but remain undisturbed. But he also said I could listen to it someday. Danny added, maybe someday is now. Maybe 30 years is long enough. His testimony changed everything. If Louis had told Danny that someone could eventually listen, then perhaps he had not intended permanent secrecy. Perhaps he had simply wanted time. The recording was released in 2002 as a single-track album titled Farewell, Tokens. Name Louis Armstrong's last performance. The liner notes explained the circumstances of its creation and discovery. Critics struggled to describe what they heard. This was not the joyful, entertaining Armstrong of the hit records. This was something more essential, more naked. A man using music to say goodbye to everything he had loved. The New York Times called it almost unbearably intimate. But beyond critical reaction, ordinary listeners responded with profound emotion. They heard in that quiet trumpet the sound of someone facing death with honesty and grace. They heard music stripped of all artifice. They heard what Louis Armstrong was when everything else was taken away. The recording has since become one of the most studied performances in Armstrong's catalog. Music theorists analyze the phrasing, noting how he bent notes differently than in earlier versions. Psychologists discuss what the performance reveals about creativity under terminal conditions. Medical professionals marvel that he could play at all given his heart condition, but perhaps the most meaningful responses come from other musicians, particularly those facing their own mortality. They speak of the recording as evidence that the need to create music does not end just because the body is failing. That artistic expression is not a luxury, but a fundamental human requirement. That Louis Armstrong, 3 weeks before death, made one final statement not because he had to, but because he chose to. In the years since its release, Farewell has been used in unexpected contexts. It plays at memorial services for musicians. It has been sampled by artists exploring themes of mortality and legacy. It appears in films about aging and death, providing emotional weight to scenes about saying goodbye. But perhaps its most significant impact is quieter and more personal. The recording has become a companion for people facing their own final chapters. Cancer patients listen to it and hear someone who refused to let illness define the end. Elderly people confronting diminishment find comfort in the proof that essential identity persists even as the body fails. Family members sitting with dying loved ones play it softly in hospital rooms, and the gentle trumpet seems to say that death is not erasure but transformation. What makes the recording so powerful is not just its historical significance or emotional content. It is the knowledge of the circumstances surrounding its creation. Louis Armstrong, forbidden to play, chose music over obedience to medical authority. He risked his remaining time for one final performance. That choice reveals everything about what music meant to him. It was not career, not entertainment, not even art in the abstract sense. It was the language he spoke when English failed, the way he processed experience, the method by which he made sense of being alive. To ask him not to play was to ask him not to be himself. And in the end, being himself mattered more than a few extra days of carefully managed decline. The tape also answers a question that haunted Armstrong's legacy for years. Critics had sometimes dismissed him as an entertainer rather than an artist, someone who played to crowds rather than pursuing pure musical expression. The existence of this secret final recording demolishes that narrative. Here is Louis Armstrong making music with no audience, no commercial consideration, no concern for anything except honest expression. Here is the proof that underneath all the performance, all the smiling and crowd-pleasing, there was an artist who needed music the way other people need air. The recording is 3 minutes and 42 seconds long, but it contains the truth of an entire life. Louis Armstrong died not knowing whether anyone would ever hear his final recording. He made it for himself, to prove the music was still there, that he could still access the thing that made him who he was, that dying had not killed the essential core. The fact that the world eventually heard it, that it became recognized as one of his most significant recordings, would probably have surprised him. But perhaps not. Perhaps on some level he knew that real music, honest music, always finds its audience eventually. Perhaps he trusted that if the recording mattered, it would survive the years of hiding and emerge when the time was right. The trumpet sits now in the Louis Armstrong House Museum, preserved under glass, no longer playable. Visitors come from around the world to see it, to stand in the room where he practiced, to imagine the music that once filled this space. But the real legacy is not the physical instrument. It is the recording made with it in the middle of the night by a dying man who chose music over safety. That tape is the gift Louis Armstrong left behind for everyone who has ever faced the end of something and wondered how to say goodbye. He showed us how. With honesty, with beauty, with music that speaks what words cannot. With one last note, held as long as breath allows, then released into silence, trusting that silence to carry the sound forward long after the player is gone. That is the story of Louis Armstrong's final recording. Not a triumphant ending, not a tragedy, just the quiet truth of a man who loved music more than life and who proved that love in the final act of creating it, when every reason said he should not. The performance nobody was meant to hear became the performance everyone needed to hear. And 30 years after his death, Louis Armstrong gave the world one final gift. The sound of an artist refusing to let death have the last word. The music would speak. And it did, and it still does.